Grandpa lived far from the city, and I didn't visit him often. Time always found a way to come between us. Work, school, and later just life itself, which, as usual, pulls you into the whirlwind of things. I remember the last time I was there was over a year ago, and even then, it was just a short visit. I always thought we'd have time to talk, to catch up, but now he's gone. He passed away 2 weeks ago, and all of this felt like some kind of surreal dream. I sat at the funeral staring at the casket, but it hadn't really hit me that he was no longer here. Mom asked me to go to his house to sort through his belongings. She said she just couldn't bring herself to do it. I left early in the morning. The road led through hills and sparse fields. Grandpa loved solitude, and his house stood far from any signs of civilization. The old, creaky, 2-story house was surrounded by overgrown bushes and sparse trees that seemed to have long stopped caring where they grew. When I pulled up, the first thing that struck me was the silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that couldn't be ignored. The house stood there, frozen in its own time. I noticed the peeling paint on the wooden walls and the old nameplate, barely visible behind the green moss. This place always seemed strange to me. Too quiet, too isolated. Grandpa wasn't much of a talker, but I knew he loved this place. It was his refuge from the outside world, from the noise, from people. Maybe that's why I didn't visit often. As I approached the door, I was hit by a mix of sadness and a strange guilt. Maybe it was because I hadn't been there earlier, hadn't helped him in his later years. Maybe it was because I realized I was about to sift through his life piece by piece, going through things he was attached to. The key was under the old stone by the entrance. The door creaked open with that familiar sound I remembered from my childhood. That sound always seemed eerie to me, as if the house was breathing or grumbling at those who disturbed it. Inside, it was cold and gloomy. The furniture was covered in dust, and the curtains, once light beige, were now almost gray. Everything here smelled of time standing still. In the corner were his old hunting rifles, and on the table was a stack of old letters, yellowed with age. I walked through the rooms, trying to assess the work ahead. After inspecting the house, I decided to go outside and see what was left out there. In the distance, beyond the garden, I could see the shed, or rather, a hangar. Huge, almost absurdly large for such an old house. I remembered that as a kid I never went inside, though I was always curious. Grandpa rarely talked about what he kept in there, and he himself rarely went inside. Now it was my turn to find out. I walked closer. The iron walls of the shed were rusted, the roof sagging in places, and the whole thing looked like it could collapse at any moment. It was strange that such a building even stood in such a remote place. I opened the creaky gates, and inside, I was met with a chill and a musty smell, as if the air hadn't moved in years. Inside, it was empty. Dusty shelves, old boxes, nothing special. In the center of the hangar on the floor lay a large metal sheet that didn't quite fit the rest of the place. The metal looked surprisingly new, as if it had been placed there recently. Something was off. Curiosity got the better of me, and gathering my strength, I lifted the sheet. Underneath was a pit. Deep, dark, bottomless. At first glance, there was no visible bottom, and something inside me immediately tensed. I stood at the edge, staring into it, but I couldn't see anything other than inky darkness. This place gave me an unsettling feeling, but my curiosity wouldn't let go. I grabbed an old, rusty wrench from the shelf and threw it into the pit, listening for the sound of it hitting the bottom. Silence. There was no sound of impact, no echo, as if I had thrown it into a void. This intrigued me. I threw another object, this time a brick I found by the wall. Nothing. No thud, no rustle. Something wasn't right. I felt a strange, overwhelming urge to know what was down there. I found a rag, wrapped it around an old stick, lit it, and threw it into the pit. The flame illuminated only a small area around it, and it fell slowly as if being pulled into an endless void. My unease grew. The rag burned as it fell farther and farther, yet I still couldn't see the bottom. I watched as the flame flickered away, vanishing into the distance. What is this? I recoiled, gripped by fear. This wasn't an ordinary pit. There was something unnatural, something wrong about it, and I couldn't explain it. I leaned closer to the edge again, trying to see anything in the depths. And then, it was as if I hit an invisible wall, and before I could comprehend what was happening, an unknown force shoved me. I felt myself lose balance, and a moment later, everything spun around me as I tumbled down. I tried to grab the edge, but my hands just slipped off the concrete rim. I was falling deeper, and fear gripped me. The air whooshed past, but I couldn't feel an end. The last thing I remember was the endless darkness wrapping around me like a blanket before I blacked out. I woke up to someone shaking me by the shoulder. It was a strange sensation, like I had just been pulled out of a deep sleep that had suddenly been cut short. Opening my eyes, I saw a person in front of me. A stranger. His face was hidden beneath a helmet, but it wasn't a modern helmet. I recognized it instantly, like I'd seen it before. In movies, in pictures that depicted ancient Rome. He was dressed in full legionary armor, just like the ones I'd seen in documentaries on TV. This strange man was shaking my shoulder, as if I'd been asleep for too long, and his voice was sharp. "Wake up, Aurelius! We need to hurry!" he shouted. Aurelius? Who's Aurelius? My head was spinning, and at first I thought this was some sort of prank or a weird dream. But his grip on my shoulder was real, and I couldn't just ignore it. I tried to gather my scattered thoughts. Who was this man? Why was he dressed like a Roman soldier? And why was he calling me by that name? "Are you all right? Hurry, we need to go!" he urged, shaking me again as if every second mattered. Slowly, I got to my feet, trying to make sense of what was happening. My body felt strangely heavy, my muscles aching like I'd been sitting in the same position for too long. Looking around, I realized I'd been sitting under a massive tree, the grass around me flattened. But that wasn't the strangest thing. People were bustling around, and they all looked just like him. I was in the middle of a Roman camp, a real one, like from ancient times. Tents, fires, people in armor gathering weapons and gear, and horses tied up nearby. My head started to spin from all the thoughts racing through it. What's going on? How did I end up here? Is this a dream? Or something else? I still couldn't figure out where this legionary had come from or why he was calling me Aurelius. As I stood, a man with a stern expression, likely higher in rank based on his appearance, was walking toward me from away from the tree. He called out loudly in my direction, "Aurelius, faster! To the formation!" I didn't know how to respond, but something inside me stirred. It was as if my will was swallowed up by the overall frenzy. People around me were forming ranks, grabbing spears and shields, and I started moving too. Confusion swelled inside me, but my legs carried me forward on their own. I had no idea where I was going or what was even happening. It felt too real to be a dream, but it was so implausible that I couldn't accept it as reality. We began to line up, preparing for something. Commands echoed around us, followed by the heavy sounds of footsteps. As we marched, my thoughts were fixed on the last thing I remembered. The pit, the metal sheet, Was that real? Or am I in a dream now? Somehow did I travel through time? Or is this just a nightmare I'll wake up from soon? I tried to mentally cling to the memory of that dark void and the cold that I'd woken up from. I turned my head and, with a nervous chuckle, said to the nearest legionary, "So what, we're filming a movie, huh?" He looked at me slowly, as if I had gone mad. His eyes narrowed, and without a word he turned away, focusing on his own thoughts. His face reflected a mix of confusion and disdain. Something about his silence unsettled me. This didn't feel like a movie set or a reenactment. Everything around me was too real. Could this really not be a dream? Before I could fully process what was happening, everything escalated too quickly. From the forest, as if out of nowhere, strange people appeared. They rushed at us with shouts, wielding axes, clubs, and makeshift spears. Their bodies were draped in animal skins, their faces painted in bright colors, as if they'd been preparing for battle their entire lives. I'd only seen barbarians in books and films, but these people were far fiercer and more real than I could have imagined. They screamed, charging forward with wild, inhuman cries. The legionaries reacted instantly. One of the officers standing nearby shouted a command, and in a flash the ranks began to form. The soldiers, trained to act as a single machine, raised their shields, forming a wall of steel and leather. Behind them, spears extended, pointing toward the enemy. I heard the clanking of metal as the soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, every detail of their training kicking in as if by instinct. And I stood there, stunned, in the middle of all this chaos. Everything happening was not just strange, it was shockingly real. The barbarians descended upon us like wolves. They slammed into the shields, shrieking and trying to break through the defensive line, but the Romans held firm. The shields stayed up. I watched as the legionaries coolly delivered blows with their short swords, their movements precise and deadly, piercing through the attackers' defenses. It was like watching a well-oiled machine. Every legionary knew their place and played their part. But not me. I was frozen. The screams around me were deafening. I saw blood splattering on the ground, watched as one of the barbarians swung an axe and struck a legionary on the helmet, knocking him to the ground. He fell, his shield shattered from the blow, and in the next second, the barbarian drove his weapon into the soldier's chest. I stood off to the side, watching as people around me died, my feet glued to the ground. Panic washed over me. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a dream. Everything around me was terrifyingly real. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as if my mind refused to accept what was happening. I saw one of the legionaries get pierced by a spear, his face contorting in pain before he collapsed, his blood soaking the earth. The Romans kept holding their ground. Their formation was tight, unbreakable. They stood side by side, defending with their shields, fighting in unison like a single entity. Spears thrust forward, stabbing into the barbarians, who charged at them like wild beasts. I heard the commanders' shouts, their voices cutting through the air, urging the legionaries to keep fighting. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest when suddenly a barbarian with an axe charged straight at me. My whole body tensed in fear, but instinct took over. I raised the shield, just as I had seen the other legionaries do, feeling its weight in my hand. The gladius was in my other hand, but it felt so unfamiliar that I could barely hold it. The axe came down on the shield with incredible force. The metal rang out, and my arm went numb from the blow. The barbarian loomed over me, his face twisted with rage, his eyes burning with a wild fire. He kept attacking, swinging the axe again and again at my shield. With each strike, I backed away, feeling the ground slipping from under my feet. Every second I was losing this fight more and more. I tried to strike back, but it was clumsy and awkward. The barbarian easily deflected my sword and lunged at me again. I thought this was the end. I was being pushed closer and closer to the tree line, my strength fading. The shield trembled in my hand, and I could barely hold it up. He was ready to deliver the final blow. And then suddenly, the sharp whistle of a sword cutting through the air. The man who had woken me, the first legionary I saw, appeared as if from nowhere. With incredible speed, he struck the barbarian with his gladius, slicing into his side. The barbarian staggered, dropping the axe, and collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. "What's wrong with you?" the legionary asked again, grabbing my shoulder and shaking me. His voice was harsh, almost irritated. I couldn't respond. The words stuck in my throat. This whole reality, this horror, I didn't know how to react. My mind refused to accept that all of this was real. The battle lasted a few more minutes, but soon the barbarians began to retreat. The legionaries, coordinated and methodical, repelled the attack, and the shouts slowly began to die down. The barbarians vanished into the forest, leaving behind the bodies of their comrades scattered across the field. I stood there, trying to gather myself as everything went quiet. After the battle, the legionaries began inspecting the battlefield. Grim and focused, they moved as if by habit, without emotion, without haste. The first thing they did was gather their fallen comrades. The bodies of the legionaries were laid out carefully, covered with their shields, prepared for burial according to tradition. They didn't leave their dead behind. They didn't leave the barbarians either. Officers inspected their bodies, checking to see if there were any leaders or particularly important enemies among them. Many of the barbarians wore no armor, armed only with makeshift weapons. The legionaries searched them, collecting trophies, weapons, jewelry, sometimes items that might have value. I saw one soldier crouch down, inspecting the body of a dead barbarian. He pulled out a short knife and cut a necklace of teeth from the barbarian's neck, examining it closely. Other Romans quickly resumed their duties, going back to their tasks. It was a harsh, emotionless process. For them, this was everyday life, something they accepted. I stood off to the side, still unable to move. This wasn't a game, it wasn't a movie set, and it was definitely not a dream. I realized that I was in another reality, where death and violence were part of life, part of their world. The unit continued to march. We crossed the field, slowly moving toward some destination that was unclear to me. This time, it seemed like I had finally started to come to my senses. Everything that had happened was shocking, but clarity was beginning to return. I didn't know for sure if I had traveled to the past, or if this was some kind of parallel universe, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was that I was here, and I needed to act according to the circumstances. For now, I was a legionary, and my position didn't allow me to just run away. I knew deserters in ancient Rome had no chance. They were executed without hesitation. Running was suicide. I tried to recall everything I knew about this time. Did I remember anything useful? Yes, some things came to mind. For example, the sword I held in my hand was called a gladius. Why was it so short? It was part of their strategy. The legionaries used massive shields, scuta, and the short swords were perfect for stabbing in close combat. It was a battering ram tactic, and it allowed the Romans to hold the line and advance effectively. I understood the basics, but beyond that, all I could do was learn as I went. I learned that the legionary who had saved me in battle was named Marcus Avidius. Apparently, he was my friend, or the friend of this body I seem to have ended up in. It was a strange realization, but I tried not to dwell on what this new world meant. I just needed to survive. At some point, I found a piece of polished metal lying on the ground near one of the soldiers. It gleamed in the sunlight, and I absent-mindedly picked it up to look at my reflection. What I saw made me flinch. My face. It was completely different. I was no longer myself. I stared into the eyes of a stranger, strong, with a tanned face and short dark hair. The face was rougher than mine, more mature, like it belonged to someone who was used to hardship. I dropped the metal, feeling my heart race at this discovery. It was unsettling. My body, my appearance, it was all gone. I was someone else, and that made me feel like a foreigner even within myself. But I didn't have time for self-pity. I had to keep going. We marched for half a day. The heat bore down on my shoulders, my legs ached from the unfamiliar exertion, and I realized that traveling in these sandals was a trial. They weren't comfortable by modern standards, with rough leather straps rubbing against my feet, and every step sent a jolt up my calves. My clothing was simple, a tunic and armor that weighed far more than I had imagined. The steel plates on my chest pressed down on my shoulders, straining my back muscles, and I was only just starting to get used to the weight. And all of this, under the blazing sun. I could feel sweat running down my body, but the other legionaries marched as if this was nothing out of the ordinary. Finally, by evening, we stopped near a small forest to set up camp. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, while the others immediately got to work. The legionaries quickly and efficiently began fortifying the area. They dug a trench around the perimeter, raised small earthworks, and set wooden stakes along the top. All of this happened with remarkable speed and discipline. Every soldier knew his place and his duties. It was like a military machine where every gear turned flawlessly. I started helping, following the others, mimicking their actions. We set up tents and shelters, preparing for the night. Around the fires, there was already a buzz of activity. Some were cooking, others sharpening their swords or mending armor. All of this reminded me that I had found myself in a completely foreign world, and I had to learn how to survive in it. I sat by the fire, cross-legged, staring into the flames that softly illuminated the faces of the legionaries around me. The crackling of the wood, the smell of smoke, and the warmth radiating from the fire after a long, exhausting day were the only things keeping my mind from spiraling into darker thoughts. I was drained, physically and mentally. Every muscle ached, and my head swirled with hundreds of questions for which I had no answers. But I had to pretend everything was fine. No one here could suspect that I felt like a stranger in this world. Suddenly, Marcus, the same legionary who had saved my life during the battle, approached me. He sat down across from me, watching me closely. There was something unsettling in his gaze, as if he was trying to figure out what was going on with me. "You're acting strange, Aurelius," he said, leaning in so his words wouldn't be overheard by the others. "Are you all right?" I flinched, trying to hide my confusion. What could I possibly tell him? Admit that I didn't remember how I got here and that this wasn't my body? He'd think I was crazy. I forced a strained smile and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just been a rough day." Marcus looked at me for a few more seconds as if trying to read my mind before continuing. "Well, you just seem like you're not yourself," he said with a slight smirk, though there was still tension in his voice. I decided to change the subject before he started asking more uncomfortable questions. "Where are we headed anyway?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible, though internally I was filled with unease. Marcus raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by my question. "Did you forget?" he said with a slight chuckle. "We're marching north to the barbarian village. We've been ordered to clear it out. Our scouts reported that forces are gathering there, preparing for raids. We need to stop them before they hit our outposts." I pretended to remember, even though inside a new wave of anxiety swept over me. Clearing out a barbarian village. This didn't sound like a walk in the park. I had seen what they were capable of in battle, and the thought of another fight filled me with dread. "Got it. I guess I was just lost in my own thoughts," I said, hoping he wouldn't ask any more questions about my condition. Marcus nodded slightly, turning his gaze back to the fire, and there was a brief silence. Then he spoke again. "You know, after that last fight, I started thinking, what would you do if you had the choice? Stay in the Legion or leave? You've always been the one who wanted something more. Remember how you used to talk about a peaceful life? Maybe even having land somewhere in the provinces?" His question made me pause. Whoever this Aurelius was, his life was a mystery to me. Unlike Marcus, I could leave, if only I knew how. But here, in this world, I didn't have that choice. The only option was to pretend. "Yeah, I remember," I lied, somewhat uncertainly. "But now, I don't think it's possible. We all have to do what we must." Marcus nodded again, as if he understood what I meant. "You're right. Now's not the time for dreaming," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The barbarians won't leave us in peace. If we don't stop them, no one will. But you know what's interesting?" Marcus spoke with a sudden pensiveness in his voice. "I've heard these barbarians aren't just wild people. Some say there's something strange about them. There are rumors that they have creatures in their ranks that aren't fully human. Some say they can turn into beasts." I tensed up at his words. Turning into beasts? It sounded absurd, but with everything that had been happening, I couldn't rule anything out. Maybe this world was stranger than I had thought. "Beasts?" I asked, trying to keep my surprise hidden. "What do you mean?" Marcus shrugged. "I don't know, friend. It's just rumors. But some of the men have said they've seen them up north. Beasts in human form who can shift shapes. I don't believe it, of course. But after everything we've seen, I wouldn't be surprised anymore." We both fell silent. The fire crackled softly, and I felt a new sense of unease creeping into me. If these rumors were true, our journey could be far more dangerous than I'd anticipated. My first night in camp was filled with anxiety and exhaustion. I lay on a rough straw mat under the open sky, still feeling the weight of the Roman tunic and armor, which I had barely managed to remove before sleep. Around me, I could hear the snores of soldiers, the rustling of tents, and the occasional shouts of the sentries patrolling the camp. But I couldn't relax. My mind was racing, and everything around me seemed absurd, as if I were living in some distorted dream. I thought about how this was even possible, how I ended up here, in the body of this Aurelius, and what awaited me next. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every rustle or gust of wind felt like a threat. Something inside me wouldn't let me rest, perhaps lingering panic from the recent battle, or maybe something deeper, tied to this world that now surrounded me. Could sleep ever bring me back? Or was this my reality now? These thoughts gnawed at me until finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. We rose with the first light of dawn. In the Roman Legion, everything was precise. The day began with the sunrise, when the first rays pierced through the trees and the mist hung low over the ground. The soldiers quickly packed their belongings and prepared to march. I followed their example, trying not to stand out. Breakfast was a simple meal of bread and water, a stark reminder of the harshness of this life. The camp was broken down with surprising speed and efficiency. We continued our journey, and the road led us deeper into the forest. The greenery thickened around us, and the trees grew closer together. The forest was old, with thick trunks and branches twisted so tightly that they seemed to block out the light. The sound of birds and the rustle of leaves surrounded us, but there was something ominous in this place that kept me on edge. I marched among the other legionaries, trying to stay close to Marcus, who occasionally glanced at me, as if still unsure of my condition. We walked through the forest for several more hours, the trees growing taller and the air heavier. The branches hung so low that at times we had to push them aside with our hands. Everything around us felt ancient, as if this forest held secrets from a time long past, secrets better left unknown. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, and I wasn't alone. Many of the legionaries looked uneasy, as if they too sensed the presence of something foreign. Finally, the road brought us to a clearing. What we saw there made me stop in my tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a strange, eerie altar. The barbarians had apparently built it from bones and trees, held together with crude, almost savage methods. A tall wooden platform, covered in animal and human skulls, stood at the center. Piles of bones, painted red and black, with strips of hide hanging like fetishes, were stacked on top. The altar was surrounded by wooden totems carved with grotesque faces, as if the barbarians worshipped something ancient and dark. On the ground around the altar were symbols etched into the dirt. Strange marks I couldn't recognize, but they radiated a sinister energy. A heavy silence fell over our group. No one spoke, but everyone stopped, mesmerized by the sight. Even the seasoned legionaries who had seen their share of battles looked unnerved. Marcus stepped closer to me and whispered, "This is the work of the barbarians. They believe in their primitive gods. But something is off here. I don't like this place." I nodded silently. I didn't like it either. The place radiated something dark, as if the forest itself was watching us, waiting for us to make our next move. We continued on, but the atmosphere had changed. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves. At first it was just murmurs, but soon rumors spread that these forests were not just home to barbarians, but to real monsters. The soldiers exchanged glances, and every crack of a branch or rustle of grass heightened the tension. The once determined and focused expressions were now filled with uncertainty. Fear slowly crept into everyone's hearts. Then something happened that shook the group's confidence entirely. We came across a trail of footprints in the earth. They were wolf tracks, but far too large for any normal wolf. I had never seen wolf tracks that size. Each paw was as large as a human foot, and there were many of them, as if a pack of dozens had passed through here recently. The centurion leading our group noticed the soldiers exchanging uneasy looks and called us to a halt. He barked, "This is the enemy trying to scare us. These tracks are nothing more than a trick. We must not give in to fear, for fear is our greatest weakness. Remember who we are? Roman legionaries. We fight for the greatest empire on earth, and they are nothing but savages." His words were harsh, but even they couldn't completely suppress the growing sense of dread in each of us. Even I couldn't shake the unease those tracks stirred within me. We pressed on, but our pace slowed, as if the forest itself was trying to hold us back. Soon, a mountain loomed ahead, surrounded by dense woods. Its dark, imposing peak towered above us, as though it were watching our every step. At the very top, black smoke coiled into the sky in twisting streams. The smoke looked like a sinister omen. Something was happening up there, something that clearly wasn't good. We paused for a moment, staring at the smoke. Silence fell over the group again, and I noticed the soldiers whispering louder than before. Talk of curses, monsters, and ancient barbarian rituals filled the air, like ghosts. Even the steeliest of legionaries began to show signs of unease. But despite the fear, we pressed on. No one wanted to be the one to show weakness. The road narrowed as we moved forward, winding through the trees with the dense forest looming over us, blocking out the sky. Every step felt heavier, and even the birds had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. We walked for a long time until finally, rooftops appeared in the distance. It was a barbarian village. The village looked wild and crude. The houses were made of wood and hides, and tall wooden fences topped with sharp stakes surrounded the area, as if they were expecting an attack. Amulets made from bones, skulls of animals and people, hung everywhere, strung together on ropes that swayed in the wind. In the center of the village stood a tall pole, adorned with symbols I couldn't recognize, but they resembled something ancient and ominous. We stopped at the edge of the village, and the centurion ordered us to prepare for battle. Despite the commands, I could see the soldiers hesitating. The murmur of voices grew louder. No one knew what to expect ahead. We stood at the edge of the village, prepared for an attack, but no one came out to meet us. The soldiers gripped their shields and swords, tense and ready for battle, expecting the barbarians to rush out of their homes at any moment for an ambush. But time passed, and the silence in the village continued to surround us. It was strange. Nothing was happening. The centurion frowned. It seemed that the silence was troubling him too. After a moment of thought, he called one of the soldiers and ordered him to scout the area. The soldier didn't seem thrilled about the task, but not daring to argue, headed toward the village. We stood watching him, following his every step, waiting for something to happen at any moment. The soldier moved slowly between the houses, looking around. We waited, holding our breath, as if ready to jump up at any moment. After a few minutes, he returned, slightly out of breath, and reported to the centurion. "There are no warriors in the village, sir. I saw no one but old people and women." The centurion frowned, clearly not expecting this turn of events. He glanced at his scouts and ordered them to search the area. Once again, we were left waiting. Time dragged on, and the tension grew. I could hear whispers among the soldiers. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Where were the barbarians? Why had they left the village? Was this a trap? The scouts returned after a while and reported that everything was clear. No ambushes, no hidden troops nearby. Hearing this, the centurion gave the order to enter the village. We moved forward cautiously, crossing the village threshold. The centurion ordered a search of every house and for all the villagers to be gathered. The legionaries acted quickly and efficiently as always. They entered homes, pulling people out, old men, women, and children. The villagers looked at us with distrust and fear, but they didn't resist. They were dragged outside, lined up, and some were questioned. It was a cold, mechanical action. We were invaders to them, and though I tried to remain neutral, a strange feeling crept over me. Each house was thoroughly searched. The legionaries were looking for weapons, hidden supplies, anything that might reveal the presence of an enemy. They rummaged through every corner, dragging things outside, overturning furniture. It wasn't wild cruelty, but a disciplined operation. Romans always acted according to a clear plan. But the atmosphere was oppressive. The villagers clearly knew something we didn't understand. I watched everything with growing unease. Where were the warriors? Why had they left, abandoning their families without protection? My mind buzzed with guesses, but the answers eluded me. The only thing that was clear was that this place held some kind of secret. The legionaries began interrogating the villagers. They went one by one, asking the same question. Where are the warriors? But no one answered. The barbarians only lowered their eyes or stared back with hatred, saying nothing. The tension grew, and it felt like the unit was on edge. With each silent response, the centurion became more irritated, his voice growing harsher, his orders more severe. Suddenly, one of the soldiers approached the centurion, looking down as if afraid to speak, and quietly reported, "Sir, there's an old woman at the end of the village. She refuses to come out. We tried, but she won't comply." The centurion spun toward him, nearly shouting, "Why are you hesitating? Drag her out by force." The soldier hesitated, seemingly battling his own fears, and continued, "I think she's a shaman, sir. We're afraid she might curse us." These words enraged the centurion. His face twisted in anger, and he nearly growled, "A curse? You're a Roman legionary, not a child. Act or I'll curse you myself. Where is this witch?" Fed up with the soldier's reluctance, he stormed toward the old woman's house, striding through the village in fury. I decided to follow him. Something told me this encounter would be important. When we reached the small, crumbling house at the edge of the village, the centurion threw open the door and stormed inside. From outside, we heard things crashing inside, and moments later the centurion dragged the old woman out. She was terrifying to look at, bent over with wild, tangled gray hair that obscured half her face. Her eyes were wild and crazed, and her mouth muttered something unintelligible, as if chanting ancient spells. She was a nightmare come to life. And then, with inhuman speed, the old woman lunged at the centurion's leg as if to bite him. The centurion shoved her so hard that she flew back several feet. The old woman began shrieking, as if she had lost her mind, shouting curses in a language I didn't understand. Her cries were horrific, piercing, as though she was calling on ancient forces for help. The legionaries recoiled in fear, and even I felt a chill run down my spine. It was too strange, too eerie. The centurion couldn't take it anymore. His face was twisted with both rage and fear, and without hesitation he drew his sword and with a single stroke beheaded her. Her screams stopped instantly, and her head rolled away, leaving a red streak of blood behind. "Get rid of her," he barked, glaring at his subordinates, who reluctantly moved to obey his order. After that, the centurion headed back toward the old woman's house, and I followed him, though something inside told me nothing good would come of this. When I entered her house, it was even more horrifying than I had imagined. The walls were covered with old rags and animal skins hanging like ritual fetishes. Bones, skulls, feathers, and carved wooden totems with faces twisted in fear were strewn everywhere. In the corner was a pile of rotting plants and herbs that gave off a foul odor. On the floor was a strange symbol, a large circle with lines intertwined like an ancient pattern. In the center of the circle stood small wooden idols, as if symbolizing unknown gods. But the most horrifying thing was on the table. There were bones. Not just animal bones, but human remains. Skulls of children and adults were carefully arranged into strange shapes, covered in dried bloodstains. Around them were small vessels filled with a dark liquid that gave off a stench so foul it made me nauseous. It was like a macabre altar, built for unspeakable rituals. I stared at it all, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. This place reeked of ancient fears and curses. The centurion glanced around the room and I saw his face twist in disgust and anger. He cursed, spitting on the floor, and turned to me, his voice sharp, almost growling. "Burn all of this, immediately. We can't leave anything here." I had no choice. Orders were not up for discussion. I nodded silently and began to act. Everything around me felt eerie. Every object in this shaman's house breathed with ancient malice and something otherworldly. I gathered kindling and branches scattered around the house, and soon the flames began to hungrily consume the old wooden structure. The fire crackled loudly, and smoke billowed into the sky. The burning house made strange sounds, as if something inside was resisting, silently screaming. I stood, watching as the flames engulfed the walls, crawled across the roof and windows, destroying everything. The bone idols and fetishes melted or cracked, breaking under the heat. It felt like a ritual of purification, but the fear lingered. Whatever this old woman had done here, her darkness was woven into every part of this place, and even the fire couldn't dispel the sense of dread. When I returned, it was already getting dark. The villagers had been herded into one part of the village like livestock in a pen. They were tied to wooden posts, sitting with grim, resigned faces, not making a sound. The barbarians' fear of the Romans was obvious, but something told me they weren't afraid of us. They feared something else, something that might come with the nightfall. The other legionaries began setting up camp. As usual, they dug a trench, put up wooden fences and stakes around the perimeter. It was the standard procedure. The legionaries were trained to fortify their position on any terrain, whether in the forest or open fields. Their actions were so coordinated that the camp seemed to appear instantly. Fires were lit, food was prepared, weapons were sharpened, but the atmosphere was tense. Darkness fell faster, and the sense of looming danger hung in the air. Everyone was expecting an attack. The centurion, though trying to keep calm, was clearly on edge. He felt it just as I did. Something was going to happen. You could feel it in your skin. I stood by one of the fires, warming my hands, but my mind was elsewhere. Whatever was happening in this village, the shaman and her rituals clearly played a role in it. These people, the barbarians, weren't just waiting for their fate. They knew something that we didn't. And that fear, the one that gripped their hearts, wasn't because of the Roman soldiers. I saw how they looked at the forest around them, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows of the trees. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that monsters didn't exist. I was a man of the 21st century, with a rational mind, and I couldn't believe in ancient superstitions about creatures and curses. But then again, this place, I didn't know it. This could be another world, where everything that seemed like myths in my time was reality. And that fear that filled the soldiers, it spread to me. What if there really were creatures out here, the ones the barbarians spoke of and even our own scouts whispered about? Suddenly, a soldier burst out of the darkness. He was pale, his face slick with sweat, and his eyes wide with terror. He stopped in front of the centurion, gasping for breath as if he had just run a long distance. "Sir, there, "Something strange happened with the old woman," he blurted out between breaths. "I took her body to the edge of the village, but when I checked, something's wrong." The centurion straightened, his face momentarily clouded. He, like all of us, tried to hide his fear, but something in the soldier's voice clearly unsettled him. "Lead us there," the centurion commanded, and without thinking, I followed. We walked through the village, where the shadows of the fires flickered on the walls of the houses, making the place even more sinister. Soon we reached the edge of the village, where the soldier had left the body of the decapitated shaman. I was prepared to see her mutilated body, but what we found was far worse. The old woman's body was gone, and in her place lay a massive wolf, its head severed. Its fangs gleamed in the moonlight, its eyes rolled back, and its fur still shimmered with fresh blood. But the most horrifying thing was that in one of the bloodstains, I recognized the outline of the same symbol that had been in her hut. The wolf was enormous, bigger than any creature I had ever seen. Even in the 21st century, I would have called it a monster. The sight left us all frozen in place, and even the centurion couldn't hide the tremor in his voice when he spoke. "What in the name of hell?" he whispered, glancing around as if expecting something else to emerge from the shadows. The rest of the legionaries stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the beast. I saw the fear in their eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. How could this have happened? Was this really a wolf, or something far darker? The centurion, gathering his strength, shouted sharply, "Burn it, now!" But the soldiers didn't respond immediately. They hesitated, clearly unwilling to approach this horrific scene. It was obvious that fear had gripped their hearts, and though I was terrified myself, I knew standing idle was dangerous. Finally, a few legionaries obeyed the order and reluctantly began piling branches and kindling around the creature's body. The fire started slowly, but soon the smoke rose into the sky, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating stench. The wolf burned, its body twisting and shrinking in the flames, as if even in death it was resisting. When it was over, we returned to camp in silence. No one said a word, but the fear was palpable. The night at the camp was tense, and no one allowed themselves to relax. Midnight was approaching, and darkness thickened around the camp. I was assigned to watch duty. I stood at the camp's perimeter with another legionnaire, staring into the dense forest that surrounded us like an impenetrable wall. The wind rustled the branches, and every sound seemed ominous. My companion occasionally cast nervous glances toward the trees, but we both remained silent. The camp, illuminated only by the fires, looked like a small island of light in a sea of darkness. I could feel fear slowly creeping up on me despite my attempts to remain rational. And then I heard it. A rustling sound, as if something was moving through the undergrowth. I tensed, straining to see into the darkness, and my heart began to beat faster. This sound wasn't like the usual wind through the trees. It was deliberate, cautious, as if someone or something was watching us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my companion. He nodded, and we both froze, listening to the silence that had suddenly become unbearably heavy. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes shining in the darkness. They were motionless, but I could feel something sinister lurking behind them. They were watching us as if studying our weaknesses. "Look," I whispered tensely to my companion, pointing to the glowing eyes. He froze for a moment, then, with fear etched on his face, ran to wake the centurion. I remained at my post, not taking my eyes off those glowing orbs. The creature didn't move, just watched, and that made it all the more terrifying. It was too real to be a figment of my imagination. Those eyes, that cold, calculating gaze, it felt as if it was preparing to strike. When my companion returned with the centurion and a few more soldiers, the eyes had disappeared. Nothing. The darkness swallowed the forest once more, and I began to doubt whether I had actually seen them. The centurion, of course, was displeased, but before he could voice his frustration, screams erupted from the other side of the camp. The screams of sentries, filled with terror and pain, shattered the silence. The sound of a struggle, of branches breaking, and we rushed toward the noise, my thoughts a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. When we arrived, I saw what I feared most. Among the legionnaires was a massive humanoid beast. It was neither just a wolf nor a man. The creature resembled a werewolf, like in the old legends. Its body was covered in thick dark fur, muscular and powerful, and its claws were so long that they easily tore through the legionnaire's armor. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and wolf features, with enormous fangs gleaming in the torchlight. The eyes, the very ones I had seen earlier, now burned with fury. The creature moved swiftly and with deadly precision, like a predator, tearing through our men as if they were made of straw. Its strikes were devastating. It lunged at the legionnaires with such ferocity that every swipe of its claws ripped through armor and flesh. Blood sprayed across the ground, and the dying soldiers' screams mixed with the beast's roar. I froze for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. It was a living nightmare made flesh. My thoughts raced. How could this be real? This was myth, legend, yet it was happening right before my eyes. Despite the fear, the legionnaires fought with coordination. They quickly formed a battle line, raising their shields to create a wall. Several spears struck the creature, but it seemed unfazed, swinging its limbs and fending off the attacks. The centurion shouted orders, rallying the soldiers. I watched as the legionnaires lunged into battle, swinging their swords, trying to wound the beast, but it was too strong, too fast. At one point, the creature leapt onto one of the legionnaires, tearing open his chest with its claws as if it were fabric. The legionnaire fell, choking on his own blood, and the beast prepared for another strike. But at that moment, the coordinated efforts of the soldiers paid off. Several legionnaires struck simultaneously at the beast's sides and neck. One of them drove a gladius straight into the creature's chest, and it howled in pain. I saw its massive body convulse, and for a moment it looked as though it might break free. But fortune was on our side. The soldiers continued their assault, striking again and again until finally the beast collapsed to the ground, letting out one last roar. Everyone stood still, staring at the fallen creature. It was enormous, and even in death, its body exuded an ominous power. The legionnaires, breathing heavily, looked at the defeated foe, unable to believe they had managed to kill it. I stood aside, still trembling from the adrenaline. It was something unbelievable. A werewolf. A real, living werewolf. Well, no, now it was dead. We all stood there, staring at the fallen body of the beast. The shock paralyzed the legionnaires. No one could believe what had just happened. Fear spread among the soldiers like a virus, seeping into their thoughts. But with that fear came something else. A strange, newfound confidence. Whatever this creature was, a werewolf or some other beast, it could be killed. Yes, it was stronger than any man, but the legionnaires, accustomed to fighting any enemy, began to realize that even such monsters could be defeated. The centurion was the first to snap out of his daze and started barking orders. "It's dead! Form up!" His voice was harsh, but there was a hint of calm. He knew order needed to be restored quickly before the soldiers succumbed to panic. Soon, the legionnaires began to gather, forming ranks once again, their actions becoming coordinated and precise. Some began to clear the bodies, raise shields, and prepare for the possibility of another attack. Suddenly, one of the soldiers shouted, "Look!" and pointed toward the mountain, black and menacing against the night sky. We all turned and saw a line of lights moving toward us. They were torches, and there were many of them. I counted about 20 lights, slowly descending the slope of the mountain, like a procession. Something was coming, but what exactly we didn't know. Wasting no time, the centurion shouted, "Prepare for battle!" We quickly took up our positions, forming defensive lines, raising shields and weapons, bracing for whatever might come at any moment. We waited. Time dragged on, feeling like an eternity. The torches continued moving toward us, but slowly, far too slowly. No one knew what to expect, and that made it even more terrifying. The fear of the unknown once again gripped the camp. Soldiers whispered to one another, casting anxious glances at both the forest and the approaching lights from the mountain. Hours passed, yet nothing happened. The lights stopped at a distance, and the sudden silence that followed was even more oppressive. No one moved. The forest was as quiet as before, but we all knew something was hiding behind that stillness. We stood on edge, ready for whatever attack might come next. Then I saw them. Those sinister, glowing eyes began to flicker all around the camp, like flames hidden in the shadows of the trees. There were many of them. Fear gripped my chest, but I knew this wasn't a dream. We were surrounded. They had been waiting for us outside all along, hidden in the shadows, while the torches on the mountain were nothing but a distraction. These creatures had made us watch the lights while they prepared to strike. I wanted to warn everyone, but it was too late. Suddenly, as if on some unseen command, the creatures began to leap from the darkness. They were massive, humanoid, but covered in long fur with beastly faces. Werewolves, like the one we had just killed. But now there were dozens of them. Screams erupted throughout the camp as the first beasts tore into our ranks. The legionnaires managed to raise their shields and spears, but even in the initial moments it was clear these creatures were faster and stronger than we had expected. The werewolves, like shadows, pounced from the darkness, attacking us with terrifying fury. Their claws gleamed in the firelight, ripping through armor and flesh. I stood in formation, my heart pounding wildly as the first creature lunged at me. I raised my shield, and its claws struck the metal with such force that my arms went numb. I barely kept my balance, but immediately struck back with my gladius. The blade sank into the beast's side, but it didn't fall. Instead, it snarled, dark blood pouring from the wound, and this only enraged it. It came at me again, trying to break through my shield and tear into my flesh. But I stood firm. We fought like cornered animals. The legionnaires stayed together, forming a tight formation. Shields, spears, and swords moved as one, but the creatures were relentless. They attacked from all sides, and even our well-formed defense was barely holding them back. One of the werewolves leaped onto a nearby soldier, slashing its claws across his helmet. The metal cracked, and the legionnaire collapsed with his head torn open. Screams of pain and terror echoed around us. I fought with desperate determination. My arm, wielding the gladius, ached, but I continued to strike. I stabbed the creatures' bodies, dodging their claws, but it all felt endless. One of the beasts tore my shield apart, and I nearly fell. But then Mark came to my rescue. He roared as he plunged his sword into the neck of the beast that had attacked me, and its lifeless body collapsed to the ground. "Don't give up, Aurelius," he shouted, returning to the fray, and I knew if I hesitated for even a second, it would mean my end. My thoughts were a blur. How had I ended up in this world? In this nightmare? I was fighting for my life, realizing that the monsters we had only heard about in legends were now a reality. I could no longer deny it. These creatures were real, and they were intent on killing us all. The battle raged on, seemingly for an eternity. The legionnaires fought to the last. Every sword strike, every shield bash was filled with desperation, but also with resolve. We knew that if we didn't win now, no one would return alive. I saw one werewolf leap onto a group of soldiers, tearing into them with its claws. But even in such moments, the legionnaires kept fighting. There were about 20 werewolves. We fought for a long time, and gradually we began to gain the upper hand. One by one, the monsters fell, each leaving behind a trail of blood and destruction. We were on the brink, but our determination won out. By the time the battle ended, no more than 20 of us remained. There had been 100 of us at the start, one centuria, the pride of Rome. Now, half of us lay dead on the ground, torn apart by the claws of these creatures. The forest was littered with the bodies of both legionnaires and beasts, and only the fire illuminated this bloody massacre. I stood among the carnage, exhausted, barely alive. Mark had saved my life again. Several times when I was on the verge of death, he had driven his sword into the beasts that were about to kill me. Without him, I would have been dead long ago. We survived this hell, but the cost was high. We all sat around, barely breathing, trying to recover from the bloody carnage. The fire flickered in the darkness, casting light on the field littered with the bodies of our comrades and the dead creatures. The centurion had survived too, but he was covered in blood, his own, the soldiers, and the beasts. He sat on a rock, staring blankly ahead, and even he, a man who had lived through countless battles, seemed shaken. But soon, breathing heavily, he rose to his feet. He was wounded and bloody, but his gaze was determined. First, he surveyed the remnants of his unit, then lifted his head toward the mountain, black and foreboding against the night sky. I could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that burned in our campfires. He wasn't going to retreat. "We need to finish what we started," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We'll head up the mountain and deal with whatever's causing this." The remaining soldiers, exhausted but resolute, stood up. We gathered our weapons and prepared for the climb. We set off along the path leading to the mountain. The forest around us was dense, with low-hanging branches, and the trees stood close together. Silence hung over us again, and every sound seemed threatening. I marched forward, gripping my gladius tightly, feeling the fear slowly creeping back in. Soon, we saw something strange ahead. Torches burned on either side of the path, stuck into the ground, illuminating a gruesome sight. Wooden effigies, made of sticks, scraps of cloth, and bones, stood in rows like soldiers. Each had a crudely carved face, and these dolls stared at us with hollow eyes. They stood like sentinels at the entrance to some horrific place. Each effigy was draped in amulets and bone fetishes, which clattered together in the wind, creating an eerie sound. What were they? I didn't know. Maybe some barbaric ritual or ancient symbols to ward off evil. But their presence made me shudder. It felt as though they were watching our every move, and each time I glanced back, I thought they had moved closer. We pressed on, climbing the winding path that led higher and higher up the mountain. The higher we climbed, the more the rocks and tree roots protruding from the ground reminded us we were approaching something important. The air grew colder, and the wind stronger. It blew against us, as if trying to stop our ascent. All I could think about was what awaited us at the top. What else could be hiding in these dark caves and behind these ancient rituals? My head spun with fear and uncertainty, but I couldn't allow myself to stop. Soon, we were nearly at the summit. Before us, a cave came into view, and black smoke billowed from its entrance. It was thick and heavy like fog, reaching out toward us, shrouding the path. This place felt unnatural, and every instinct I had screamed to turn back and run, but I knew we couldn't stop now. As we entered the cave, everything was enveloped in a heavy darkness, broken only by the faint glow of numerous torches set around the perimeter of a massive chamber. The walls were covered in strange, menacing symbols, and the air was thick with the smell of sacrificial blood and dampness. It felt as though this hall had not been built by men, but by forces we could barely comprehend. In the center of the hall stood enormous stone gates. They were carved from ancient stone and etched with symbols and images of monstrous creatures. Most were wolves and werewolves, their snarling faces and glowing eyes so detailed they seemed alive, as if they were watching us, waiting for their chance to break free. The carvings were so intricate, it felt like they could spring to life at any moment. But the most terrifying sight awaited us by the portal itself. There stood the very same shaman we had beheaded earlier. She was alive, or at least appeared so. Her head was back in place, though there were still visible marks around her neck from the sword stroke that should have killed her. She was chanting some ancient incantation, whispering words that sent chills down my spine. Her voice was low, and it rang out as though she were speaking to the darkness itself. Beside her, a large fire burned, and in it, I could see skulls and human bones. Suddenly, the portal began to glow brightly. I saw shadowy figures moving within the stone gates. At first, they were just vague shapes, but soon they became clearer. There were hundreds, no, thousands, of creatures, like the ones we had fought. Enormous werewolves with glowing eyes, staring at us from beyond the gate like predators preparing to pounce. My heart froze in my chest. We were standing on the edge of disaster. The centurion, realizing what was happening, didn't hesitate. He shouted, "Die, monster!" and with incredible speed hurled his spear. It shot through the air like an arrow piercing the shaman's heart. She gasped, choking on her incantation, and collapsed to the ground. Her body stilled, blood spilling onto the stone. But it seemed like it was already too late. The portal became more tangible by the second. I could see the dark world beyond it, teeming with thousands of creatures. Their glowing eyes were fixed on us, and a terrible roar filled the chamber. And then I saw it. A massive, hairy paw with sharp claws slowly pushing through the gate. Whatever was on the other side was trying to break into our world. The centurion stared at the sight, his face twisted with horror. He knew the forces were too great, that we couldn't stop them. "We've done all we can. Now we have to run and warn the others," he shouted. We turned and ran, not daring to look back. Inside me, a wild fear was burning. We raced down the mountain, leaping over rocks and roots, tearing through the forest without a care for direction. My legs carried me forward, but my mind raced with thoughts. Could I escape? Could I survive this nightmare? And what if this was only the beginning? If we didn't warn the others, what would become of us? Every step I took was filled with panic and adrenaline. The surviving legionnaires ran beside me, but each of us was consumed by terror from what we had witnessed. That portal, those creatures, one thought pounded in my head: we won't make it. But despite all these thoughts, I kept running.